Hello, everyone. As academicus, we are here today with a brand new episode. Today, we are excited that we will be talking with a prominent scholar in the foreign policy analysis field. We're glad to present you Professor Juliet Kaarbo from the University of Edinburgh. In the following moments, we will be talking with her about the latest approaches in the foreign policy analysis field, as well as her contributions to this literature. But first, I'd like to thank her on behalf of the Academicus team and our audience for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Juliet, for kindly accepting us. And then we can pass the questions and answers sections, if it is okay for you too.
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is a great thing that you're doing.
Okay, the first question is a quite comprehensive one. How would you interpret the current developments in the field of foreign policy analysis? Where would you see it heading towards?
That's a big question, and a good question. I mean, foreign policy analysis is a really big tent, right? There's a lot of research that's going on, so I don't keep up with everything. But I guess what I'm seeing kind of come through in terms of journals and books. There's a few topics that are kind of the hot topics in FPA right now. Things like populism, populist leaders and populist public opinion. Feminist perspective and gender analysis is kind of coming late to FPA, but I'm seeing more and more of that. There's been work on parliaments for a couple of decades now, but I'm seeing more on parties, political parties in foreign policy. Role theory, we may talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's kind of seen a resurgence in the last 10 years or so. And then kind of the work on leader personality has been around for a long time, but I think that's I saw an analysis not too long ago of the number of articles using operational code analysis or leadership trait analysis, and there's been an uptick of those in the last 10 years or so. So those are kind of hot topics. I think more broadly, I'm writing a chapter for a handbook of international relations on comparative foreign policy with Christian Cantier, and we're making the argument that one of the things that I think we're seeing in the last 10-20 years is a trend in FPA for more comparative research. That FPA kind of started, one of its origins was really about comparative foreign policy, and it was very quantitative, and it was very inductive, kind of doing a lot of different building up of the analysis, and it didn't go very far. And people kind of just abandoned it, and when they did, the FPA research was more single case studies, but I think for a lot of different reasons, and we can talk about that if you want, but for a lot of different reasons, after the 2000, we're seeing more, different kinds of comparison. It could be comparisons across time, or it could be comparisons of two cases in a single country. But we're also seeing more cross-national comparative foreign policy, which is I think it's not returning to the old ways, but it is a welcome development.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this great introduction. Following on your remarks as well, what we have humbly, as graduate students, thought of when we are researching or reading foreign policy analysis per se, is that when we look at the literature, there's much more of a dominance of United States-centric studies. So yet at the same time, it is also seen that the scholars contributing to the field are not diverse as well. What would you think is the reason behind this? And what would you suggest for the possible solutions?
Yeah, so I think that is a good observation and a real critique of FPA. I think FPA is not alone in this, right? If you look at other kind of IR, other political science subfields, you see similar patterns, a similar dominance by US scholars and on US cases. For FPA, I think it's just the origins of FPA were in the United States. I mean, there's some kind of foreign policy studies going on all over the world for a long time, but as a kind of defined subfield, that it traces its origins to the United States, and so that kind of continued it on. It's unfortunate, but so if you train people in a country, they tend to look at their own country. I'm not interested. I'm American. I'm not really interested in U.S. foreign policy, but it's natural to do so, and so you have people looking at U.S. foreign policy from a U.S. foreign policy analysis perspective. I mean, to be fair, the United States makes a lot of important decisions. So if that affects a lot of other countries too. So it's as a big power for a long time. Scholars all over the world are kind of gravitate to trying to explain what it does. There may be more data in the United States too. I mean, certainly compared to some other countries. So the U.S., like if we're interested in public opinion, right? There's big surveys that have been around in the US for a long time. Not every country has that. More and more do now. And there's also a tradition of kind of tell-all books coming out of the US presidency, right? So people leave and write books that may be biased, may not be really good information, but it's some information about what's going on behind closed doors, and for some other countries that's more difficult. So I guess those are some of the reasons. And then it's just a path dependency. Once you get a lot of people doing an area, then that just kind of continues on. Solution, I think teaching more classes in foreign policy analysis in other countries is one way. I think lots of different countries don't teach foreign policy analysis as much as the US, but students like the courses, even at the undergraduate level, or certainly at master's and PhD level. So you need to expose students. That's the starting point, and get them interested. And then I think FPA can do a better job at saying why it's relevant to other countries. I think that's kind of pretty obvious, but why would to convince academics working on other countries or in other countries outside of the US, they need to be convinced that foreign policy analysis says something to the big policy questions that they're looking at, or the big IR questions that they're looking at. And I think some of this is going on, but I think foreign policy analysis could do better at that. Valerie Hetzen and Klaus Brummer have a book out a few years ago. Can't remember the exact title. I should, but it's something like Foreign Policy Analysis Outside the Global North, or something like that. And it shows it's going on, but we need to raise the profile of that, and maybe journal editors or conference organizers should put more of a emphasis on comparative work or non-US work. But when I teach foreign policy analysis, I really try to find good theoretical systematic articles that aren't on the US, and there are a lot out there, but it still dominates the syllabus, which is unfortunate.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kaarbo. Other question, in your extensive academic career, you have also contributed on theory literature. So what are the recent developments and criticism in this field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have started working in world theory probably about 10-12 years ago, and a lot of my students, my own PhD students, are working in that area. So recent developments, I think, because role theory has been around a long time, since 1970 in Cal Holstey's article on national role conceptions. This more recent development, I think role theory used to be more structural, so roles were kind of determined by the international system and the structure. I think the focus now is more on the agent, right? How agents choose their roles or try to choose their roles. What about the agents, like their history or their culture or their political system, might influence what roles or role sets they want to pursue. So I think that's been the bigger turn, and with that focus on agents, kind of a symbolic interactionism and that's coming more from, I think, from Europeans researchers, working from a more constructivist understanding of how actors interact. So I think those are big recent developments. I think we're getting more countries. So back to that question, I think Cameron Tees and I edited a book series on role theory with Routledge, and we've got a lot of different books on a lot of different countries using role theory. So that's good. Role theory kind of lends itself to that kind of looking at different countries. So I think there's also more work on socialization. So not just how countries' leaders might have a particular conception or idea of the role that they want to play, but also how they're socialized by other actors. That goes along with that symbolic interactionist perspective. Contestation. So one thing I've worked on is how roles are debated and contested domestically, and so bringing in the domestic politics of role theory, I think, is more recent. And then I think I'm seeing role theory try to connect more to some other big concepts or debates within IR, things like leadership or global leadership, or recognition, studies on recognition, sovereignty and roles. So those are good. That's what I see. And your other question, critiques, was that? Yeah. So I think there's a lot of them. No theory's perfect in that way, and role theory is not really a theory. It's just kind of a framework, and you need to plug in some other middle range theories to complete it. And maybe that's a critique, but I think that's okay. For constructivists, if you present role theory research in front of constructivists, they'll always ask the question, and there's an embedded critique in there, that what's the difference between roles and identity? Why do we need roles if we already know about identity? And I think there's a long answer to that. I think there are differences. I don't think they're the same thing, and we can go into that if you want, but they are very close though. So there's theoretical differences, but empirically it's really hard to have to say this is the identity and this is the role. But I think role theory brings a lot, like the contestation idea, different ideas of socialization, this multi-level and more agent and more behavior focus than identity studies. So I think there's certain advantages of that. Another critique is, how do you know a role when you see it, right? And that comes with, what's the difference between roles and policies? So for the UK, for example, we've talked about this new role it's trying to play as global Britain. Is that a role, or is that a strategy, or is that a policy? I think it's a role. I think a role is something a little bit bigger than just a policy. But again, it's hard. A lot of role studies that you see you might just be able to call them identity studies or policy studies or something like that. So that I think there's some work we need to do within role theory. Methods, I don't think we're that sophisticated in terms of looking at roles and how to identify roles. I think there's a lot of different ways we could do it, but right now it's pretty just more interpreting different kinds of roles. I'm okay with that, but I think we could get better. And then I guess the last thing, critique I would mention is role theory has this promise of looking at both socialization. So what are the externals, the others out there, the alters in role theory parlance? What are they? How are they socializing the state? And this contestation, what's going on inside of the state and where roles are coming from. But most studies do one or the other, right? They either look at the socialization aspect, or they look at the internal contestation aspect, or they just look at how roles influence foreign policy more generally. And I think the real advantage of role theory is that you can start connecting those, but I don't see a lot of work doing that. So more work to do, more ideas for your work maybe, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kaarbo. Our last question. We would like to talk about the role contestation concept you developed with Kristen Cantor. First of all, we wonder how you came together and develop this concept. When you do your research, which actor do you think has greater say in the foreign policy making process than others?
Okay, all right. So I'll take the first one there. So how did we come together, and Christian Cantor and I, and develop this idea of role contestation? Well, it's kind of a funny story. So I was asked to go to a workshop at ISA, I'm thinking maybe 2010 or 2009, and the workshop was being organized by Cameron Tees and Marika Broining, and I know, they're friends of mine, and I know the research, and I know they worked on role theory, and they asked me to go to the workshop, and but I didn't really do role theory. I barely taught it. I kind of knew about it, but I didn't think of myself as role theory. But it's fun to go to workshops, and an extra day in New Orleans was nice. So Christian was my PhD student at the time, and I said, why don't we do something together on this? And we just started reading role theory, past work, but then some of the new stuff that was coming out from Sebastian Harnisch and others. And what struck us was that role theory tended to treat the state as a unitary actor, right? They talked about Russia's role or Turkey's role or the US role or something like that. And that even though role theory started and was being played out in foreign policy analysis, that didn't fit with everything we know about foreign policy is that policies are contested. Why wouldn't roles be? So we kind of developed this framework saying here's where role contestation can happen. It can happen vertically, so kind of between elites and the public. So the elites may decide we're going to have a new role for our country, and the public is against it, or other political groups that are outside the government may oppose it, and then horizontally we talk about role contestation can go on at the elite level. So in a group of advisors, between the leader and his or her cabinet, within a coalition, between a presidency and a parliament, or the executive and the parliament, so between parties. And what you need then, and this is where the kind of connection between role theory and middle range theory comes in. You need other theories about bureaucratic politics or decision making or the role of parliaments or something to help you understand kind of the answer to that second question, right? Who's the most important, and where is this contestation most likely to happen, and who's going to win out, right? Or is it going to deadlock or stalemate? So that was exciting, and we followed up the article with a book that's got some case studies in it, mainly democracies and mainly in the West. So there's more work to be done on contestation elsewhere as well. And to get back to the second question there too, who's the most important actor in foreign policy? I mean, I would just start with the leader. I would just kind of assume in most cases, whoever is the institutional leader of the state, that could be the president, the prime minister, the chancellor, whatever they're called. There's usually one. Sometimes it's clearly a group of leaders at the top that are running things. And I think most research in foreign policy analysis tells us those leaders can have a lot of influence. So I would start with them. Now, those leaders may share some of the responsibility. So if with the foreign minister or defense minister, or if it's a coalition government, that the authority in the cabinet may be shared across political parties. So you look at the leaders of the other parties too. And then they may be constrained by those, and then the leader may delegate. So you might start with the leader, but it may be pretty clear that for most foreign policy, they don't really care about that. We have some leaders like that, and they just delegate. And then of course day-to-day foreign policy is done by bureaucrats or people in the field or ambassadors that can have, as humans, can make a lot of impact on their country's foreign policy. But generally, I'd start with the leader and see who they're paying attention to, and go from there.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaarbo, for sharing your great answers to our long questions, per se. But before we conclude, we don't have official final questions, but before we conclude, we would like to give the word to you, in case you might have additional things to say about the foreign policy analysis or the points you raised in the interview.
Nothing burning, no burning issue comes to mind, but I'll just let me say this. So I'm also working on a Oxford Handbook of Foreign Policy Analysis, and editing that with Cameron Tees. And one thing that we're trying to do with that handbook is not so much look back and review past research on foreign policy analysis, but talk about where it should be going, and really try to address some of the critiques of the field, with some, trying to set an agenda to address those critiques. And one of our themes is that we need to reposition foreign policy analysis more centrally into the discipline, the wider discipline of international relations, because there's been a bit of a disconnect between foreign policy analysis and the rest of IR, and that's, for a long time, that was fine because IR was just dominated by realism or neoliberalism, and we were just asking very different questions. But as IR theory has kind of gone inside the state more, and has been talking about things like public opinion and institutions and leaders, that I think there's a bridge that can be built and is worth building back between IR and FPA. And then I think FPA needs to, what we're trying to do with the handbook is to say, we need to broaden out. We need to look at more kinds of actors, not just big states, but middle powers and small states, sub-state actors, like Scotland, where I'm sitting now, talk about the foreign policy of international organizations, and then also speak to some of the big questions in international relations, like nuclear proliferation or climate change. I mean, FPA is critiqued fairly, I think, for still being about a lot of the big security decisions. Like, we have a lot of studies on the Iraq War. And those are good decisions to look at, but I think we can use our tools to look at immigration or international finance, or there's a lot more that we can do, and I think that might help get back to that question you asked earlier about making this less U.S. Centered. If you start using foreign policy analysis to look at not just big security, war, military interventions, then it may seem more relevant to more people outside the U.S. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much. That's plentiful of food for thought, especially for graduate students like us, or many viewers who will be watching this recording or hearing it as a podcast, wherever they are on the platform. But Professor Kaarbo, thank you so much for spending this time with us. As graduate students, we were highly influenced by your work, reading your work, and it was as pleasurable as hearing your voice from firsthand on your take on foreign policy analysis. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I think it's a great thing that you're doing. So keep in touch.
Thank you so much, and that officially concludes our interview with Professor Kaarbo. We would like to once again thank you for accepting our invitation and being with us today. We generally talked about the foreign policy analysis, where it was and where it is heading, but we touched upon several other issues as well, which might be triggering for many students or viewers who will be watching and hearing this as well. We also would like to remind that please do not forget to follow us on our social media channels. So keep in touch and see you soon in our next interviews.